Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be doing the 12.19 tier list. Now there weren't a ton of changes this patch, at least not a ton of significant changes, but there were a lot of smaller changes, so I will timestamp all the champions below. But let's start with the biggest one. So the biggest one was Syndra. On 12.19, there was a Syndra mid-scope update, which changed a lot. TLDR of it was that it was kind of meant to make her a stronger scaling champion and kind of nerf how strong her early game was. I suppose they've succeeded in this. Like, she definitely scales a lot better than before, but her early game is actually still pretty damn strong. So the thing is, I thought that this Q going from 4 seconds to 7 seconds would make Syndra a lot worse in the early game. And I think it does in some matchups, like when you're against champions like Azir or Orianna, or champions that just, or Victor's another one, that are going to harass you really heavily in the early game that you could punish a lot with your local Q cooldown. Yeah, those matchups are much more difficult. But for most matchups, and I think for most players, unless you're a very high-ranked Syndra, you're actually just going to feel like your early game is a lot easier now. Even though it's 7 seconds, like if you're a lower elo Syndra, honestly, if you weren't a challenger Syndra, you probably weren't using it on cooldown anyway, and it's a lot more forgiving. Now the mana cost is a lot lower overall, and Syndra in general just doesn't really feel like she uses nearly as much mana as she did before. So I think for the average player, Syndra has become stronger and easier, and I think if you're a high ranked player, Syndra has become stronger in like greater variety of situations. I think she's still maybe not quite as strong as she was in her niche situations before, but overall she is just a lot stronger. So in my opinion, Syndra is honestly very, very high tier now. I'd say somewhere around here. I'd say still the biggest thing you're kind of lacking with Syndra is a bit of blind pick ability, but honestly she could probably go in the S tier, because the thing is, like, she has like more bad matchups than she does before because her cooldowns are a bit more punishable. But the thing is, it's like before, when you were punishable in bad matchups as Syndra, you didn't really have that like huge outscaling win condition to rely on. Whereas now it's like, even if your matchup doesn't go that well, you probably still scale really well and just carry the game anyway. So honestly, I would say I actually think I'm going to move Syndra up into S tier. I do think she is really, really strong. I guess the only argument really is that she isn't the best blind pick, but I really do think that her strength right now makes up for it. And I think in most bad matchups, if you know how to neutralize it, you can kind of just clear the wave out and not really have to worry. I still think there's a little bit of optimization that can be done with Syndra. As you might have seen, like all the default Syndra players, like, they're just going towards First Strike right now, and I do think First Strike is like your default best option, but I actually still think Spellbook and Phase Rush both have niche situations, so I think Spellbook versus Assassins could be quite good, and Phase Rush versus a lot of melees could be good as well. You just have to be kind of careful because First Strike does give you a ton of value, but also if you've been watching some of the Worlds games, there are definitely games where even on ranged champions, First Strike just does not give any value at all because you either don't get to fight enough or you just can't consistently proc it enough. So yeah, I'm gonna do a full in-depth guide on Syndra pretty soon, but I think she is like really, really good right now, and highly recommend picking her up. Next on our list is Ryze. So Ryze had his Q AP ratio increase, his W AP ratio increase, which is pretty nice, just gives him a little more damage. Now, I don't think this does a huge amount for Ryze in terms of, like, Ryze doesn't really struggle with damage anyway. The thing that Ryze really struggles with is being in position to do damage. So in the early game as Ryze, you can snowball the game, etc., etc. But in the mid game, you really just kind of struggle to team fight versus kind of like other mages or other long range champions. And we probably say, well, yeah, Ryze's goal isn't meant to team fight, and you're right. But the problem is, in solo queue, it pretty much always comes down to a 5v5 anyway. So even though Ryze is meant to be more of like a 1-3-1 or split push terror, he kind of just like ends up team fighting anyway. So I do think these changes are kind of nice in that if he does get to do damage, he's going to do even more damage, but I really don't think it fixes Ryze's biggest problem. So I think, honestly, it probably does move Ryze, like, I don't know, it probably moves him into the very low A+. I think, yeah, somewhere in here. Like, he's a pretty solid option. I'd just say, like, I honestly probably need a B+ category. I feel like there's just so many champs in A, and some of these champs are so different. So I think it made Ryze a little bit better. I don't think it solved his biggest problems, but I do think Ryze is pretty decent for solo queue. Gonna do a guide on Ryze as well. And also the item rework looks like it's gonna be pretty good for Ryze as well. Next we have Fizz. So I actually think this Fizz change does a bit more than people realize. So it's pretty easy to look at this and be like, okay, Fizz, he's not a champion that really gets a lot of AP for most of the game, so that kind of doesn't really help him. You know, as Fizz, you're probably only getting Rabadon's 4th. Sometimes you can get it 3rd, but for a lot of the game, you're going to be on really low AP. Now, the reason I think this changes Fizz quite a bit is the kind of thing that Fizz struggles with in the durability patch is more closing out the games and being useful late game. And this kind of gives you the extra damage late game to allow you to still kill 80 carries and stuff, or just like to splash damage on their entire team, just having a bit more damage in the combo. So I think like the Ryze change, it didn't really fix his problem, right? But I think this actually, it helps fix Fizz's problem. Like it doesn't solve it for sure, but just like being able to fall off a little bit less and just like having a bit more damage in the late game, I think actually is pretty nice. So I don't even know. I have Fizz right here. I think he is honestly probably about here. Like I think Fizz is pretty decent, could maybe even be higher, honestly. I don't see him that much at the moment, but I do think if you get a good counter pick situation, you can make sure to snowball early and then you're not going to fall off as hard as you did before. I think it's still like fairly solid overall. Now we have Galio. So Galio wasn't directly changed this patch, but Galio's actually been seeing quite a bit of play. So Galio's been playing in Korea like with the tank build quite a bit. So they've been going like Chem Tank and then kind of just like items of your choice. It could be like Randuin's, Deadman's, some people going Demonic, so that's an option. But just like generally people have been playing it with Phase Rush and then TP Ghost, and then you can either go AP or the tank build with that. So I have also just seen regular AP Galio quite a lot more recently, and it does look pretty good. It also pairs well with some of the junglers, like Hecarim. Galio is a really nice combo, so I think Galio also deserves to be a bit higher on this list, probably somewhere in here. Again, I don't think it makes him like super broken, and there are probably better roaming champions, but honestly, Galio is pretty solid. He's definitely like in the upper tier of roaming mids, I think. Ekko. So Ekko got some interesting changes, and they're actually very similar to the Fizz changes, where Ekko just does more damage late game. The reason I don't think this is as impactful as the Fizz change is that Ekko, while Ekko does actually get his Rabadons earlier in the game than Fizz, like you can realistically go something like Mythic, Zhonya's Rabadons on Ekko. The problem is, Ekko's real problem is the early game. It's not the late game like Fizz, and this doesn't really help him in the early game at all. On top of that, I just think Ekko is a much better jungler than a mid laner anyway. And there are, if you want, like the situations you'd pick Ekko into, you're better off just picking Akali or something anyway, or Sylas. So I honestly don't really think this changes Ekko's position for me. If you're an Ekko one trick and you like play Ekko a lot, it certainly probably does like do a little bit more for you, right? Like it is doing a bit more damage, but you don't really lack for damage anyway, and you still scale really well. So I think I have Ekko right here. Maybe you could shuffle him around a little bit to something like here, but really, I don't think it's a huge change. I think it's basically the same, and he's still better off as a jungler, and he just kind of, you know, gets buffed in the jungle here anyway. Nasus also got some changes this patch. So they increased his Q empowered attack range, so 25 extra range on the empowered Q, and also they increased the W attack speed slow by a fair amount. So I actually think this probably puts Nasus in the S tier counter pick category down here. Nasus is down here. So yeah, I think he's an S tier counter. I think if you're playing versus melee champions where you can kind of just stack for free and snowball, like, yeah, just like enter the mid game really, really strong, no one really being able to kill you, that's great. I still probably wouldn't play him versus mages. I feel like it's kind of just like worthless. But yeah, if you play it versus a melee champion and they have an 80 carry on their team or someone that you can actually use the W attack speed slow on, I actually think Nasus is a pretty solid option in mid. You do need to be kind of careful about what you pick it with. Like, I think you do need an AP jungler. I wouldn't want to play like a full AD comp and have a Nasus, but yeah, there are certainly situations where Nasus can be used, so I think he deserves to be on this list now. Lastly, I'm going to kind of speed run some of the champions that I've moved around in tiers. So I've moved Orianna down a little bit. I just feel like the other mages kind of carry a bit harder than her at the moment. She's still a pretty solid option, but I think the other things are just better. I think she was like, I had her up here, now I've moved her down. Akali is one I've moved up, so I think I had her in the mid A, but I've moved her all the way up here. So I think Akali, she's definitely like the premier AP assassin at the moment. She's been played a lot at Worlds, and I think she is just, yeah, I was kind of underrating her before. I think you still have to be a little careful about when you pick her, but she is good against a lot of the other meta champs, so definitely has some good options for her. Azir is another one that I've moved up slightly. So Azir's been seeing a lot of play at Worlds, and I was actually surprised. The nerfs to Azir basically did nothing to him. I was kind of surprised by that. I didn't think they'd have a huge effect, but I thought they would have some effect, and they've pretty much had none. I still think Azir in solo queue is pretty different from competitive. Like, Azir in competitive, a lot of the stuff you could do around mid priority and like gank setup is much different than you can do in solo queue. You know, it's harder to use mid priority, like coordinate mid priority in solo queue, and also gank setup is a bit less reliant in solo queue compared to competitive. So I don't think Azir is like S plus like he is in solo queue kind of, or sorry, I don't think Azir is S plus in solo queue like he is in competitive at the moment. I still think he is probably like stronger than I was kind of, you know, putting him as before, but I do think there are better mages, just like, especially if you're not a good Azir player. You know, again, maybe if you're a challenger Azir, he is still really high on the list, like it is in competitive. But for the average player, I think definitely not as high as some of the other mages. Sylas. So Sylas is another champ that got nerfed, and the nerfs pretty much did nothing to him. In fact, I would probably be willing to put Sylas in the S here. I would think Sylas is, yeah, he's definitely up there. I'm honestly not sure which order of champs like these would go in. Maybe something like this. Sylas is super strong still in solo queue, and he's being played a lot in competitive, obviously. He's just really strong. Like, solo queue really suits Sylas, and if he's been played in competitive, that means he's like extremely overtuned, probably. Yeah, he just like really thrives in the chaos, like consistently snowball games. The one drawback to Sylas really is his blind pick, and that has been nerfed like a little bit, but like, you know, for example, if you decided you were going to blind pick a different champion and then counter pick with Sylas or Syndra or something like that, like there's a lot of really good ways you can kind of get use out of these champions, and both of these champions are pretty solid blinds anyway, so I think Sylas probably does deserve to be in the S tier. Now, Lucian and Akshan have moved down both a bit. Right now, there just aren't as many AP junglers as before. Like, pretty much everyone is playing AD junglers, and also a lot of the AD junglers are very tanky. You know, it's quite hard to play into stuff like Hecarim as Lucian and Akshan. You definitely much rather be a mage, and it's just kind of rough to be playing these champions mid at the moment, so I don't really recommend them that highly. I still think they are pretty good if you get situations for them. Like that's why I've still got them in A, right? Like if you get the right game for them, they don't have a lot of CC, or you know you can snowball your lane a lot, like they're still pretty good. But I just think the kind of, at least in high elo, the common situation that's coming up with like the team comps, it's kind of making them not very valuable at the moment. All right, so I think this is the 12.19 tier list finish. So go ahead and have a look at that. Let me know what you guys think. I will quickly go to my YouTube outro. That is going to be it for this video. One thing I do want to know is, would you guys like to see this tier list earlier in the patch or not? Because the one kind of thing that I have is like, do I release it earlier in the patch where I have kind of like less, you know, confirmed knowledge? Like for example, with the Syndra knowledge or the Syndra rework, I thought she would be good, but I wasn't 100% sure. So I kind of waited to see how it would go. And that way I think the tier list becomes more accurate as a result. But the problem is like, it's a week into the patch, right? So a lot of you guys, you've played a week without having the tier list. So maybe it's like not as good to have it come out a bit later. So let me know what you guys think. Would you like to see it earlier? Would you like to see it later? I still think I should probably split them into kind of a lower elo and a higher elo tier list, just because it kind of makes more sense. Like a lot of them, especially like champs like Azir, right? It changes a lot. So that's something I'm going to look to do in future. I'll probably start that with the next season. Most likely not going to do it for this season. But anyway, guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.